Welcome to another episode of NBA 2K20 Roster Edits. Today we're going to talk about the San Antonio Spurs. And the San Antonio Spurs originally were an ABA franchise, and when the ABA folded, they moved into the NBA. And if you follow the Spurs, you know that they were a very successful franchise, kind of hit the skids the last couple seasons, but won some NBA championships in the 2000s. So let me tell you about the greatest players on Spurs history with my roster recommendations from the stock roster. Right, so the stock roster, there are some changes that need to be made, just in my opinion. And first, we'll go through the whole roster and we'll talk about those changes. Number one, Tim Duncan, power forward, if not the greatest power forward ever. David Robinson at center, before Tim Duncan, arguably the greatest Spur ever. You could argue either or, but Tim Duncan has more rings, so I guess he gets the nod. George Gervin, the ABA great, he carried the franchise for many years as their top scorer. Kawhi Leonard, of course, Kawhi Leonard started his career with the Spurs, won a couple championships there before moving on. Tony Parker, who was a longtime Spur, heart of their franchise for many championship seasons. So the next player that I'm happy to see on the game finally, because I've been adding him for years, is Larry Kenon. The only problem is there's a few things that they messed up on this game, and we'll talk about those here in a little bit. Sean Elliott, small forward. LaMarcus Aldridge, backup power forward. James Silas at shooting guard. Bruce Bowen, small forward shooting guard. Artis Gilmore, backup center. Johnny Moore as a backup point guard. Avery Johnson as a backup point guard. Danny Green, shooting guard. Robert Horry, big shot Bob at small forward. Alright, so my recommendations of removal on this team are Robert Horry, Danny Green, and finally Avery Johnson. And I know a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, Avery Johnson. Why would you remove him? Well, there already are 3 point guards. Well, Silas is a shooting guard, but there's already point guards on this team, and I'm going to add 2 other guards to this lineup. So if I added the other 2 players, then we would have 3 guards in the lineup, 2 of them not doing anything but sitting on the reserve list. So let's see what my changes are, and we'll talk a little bit about them. Alright, so obviously our starting lineup is going to feature Tony Parker at the shooting guard position. We have George Gervin, although listed as a small forward, you slot him down as the starting shooting guard because Kawhi Leonard is your starting small forward. You of course have Tim Duncan at your power forward position, followed with the Admiral, David Robinson at center. Now the first person I'm going to add is Manu Ginobili. And this is pretty close. I found a pretty close image on the player DNA section of NBA 2K20, but since Ginobili's retirement, he was omitted from the NBA 2K20 franchise, so you had to create him and add him to the roster. So this is the first addition to the roster. I feel that this is the perfect sixth man coming off the bench. He can do just about everything for you: score, pass the ball, play some defense, whatever you need him to do. And this is what I like to refer to as mid-level Ginóbili. It's not long-haired Ginóbili when he was young, and it's not really old Ginóbili from the last couple seasons. So this is middle Ginóbili that I like to call this one. So your backup power forward is LaMarcus Aldridge, who can also play the center position. And you have a backup in center, Artis Gilmore. Gilmore found more success with the Chicago Bulls, but had some very, very good seasons with the Spurs. Your backup point guard is Johnny Moore. Johnny Moore was one of the all-time greats of the Spurs. Has his number retired for them. Perfect backup point guard to Tony Parker. And this is the next one that I add to the list, and this is Spurs player Mike Mitchell. And Mitchell was kind of one of the most underrated Spurs in history, in my opinion. This guy put up some numbers. And if you don't believe me, check it out. I mean, Mike Mitchell is no longer with us, unfortunately. He has passed away, so that's probably part of the reason he can't be put on this game. You know, players that are deceased usually aren't put on here unless they get permission from the family. But Mike Mitchell was a great player, plays the small forward position. I think he could even be slotted in as a power forward if you really needed him to. But with this team, you really don't need him to be at power forward. With that being said, Larry Kenon is your backup power forward. Now you're going to notice something different about Larry Kenon that was on the original stock roster. And this is something I'm happy at the fact that they put him on the game. But number one, they didn't even get his number right. So you have to correct his number to 35 if you want his accurate number. Number two, they didn't get his position right. They listed him as a small forward. Larry Kenon was a power forward, and he was a rebounding power forward. So he was, I don't want to say like Dennis Rodman, but he was like Maurice Lucas of the Trailblazers. Yeah, he threw in some points here and there, but his definite claim to fame in real life was that he was a rebounder and bruiser down low. So you have to kind of correct Larry Kenon, in my opinion, to get his number right, to also get his attributes right, because they list him as an inside-out scorer. And I'm like, he's not an inside-out scorer. He's a rebounder defender. So that's just my recommendation, but great power forward. Very happy to see him on the team finally and on the game. Sean Elliott at small forward. He can also play some shooting guard. This is a pretty good shooter to have coming off the bench. This guy can light it up from the three. A very good one-on-one defender. Very good one-on-one offensive player as well. And finally, I round out the bottom with James Silas. This is a shooting guard, but he can also play the point guard position. Now, you may say, well, I'd rather have Bruce Bowen on that team. Perfectly fine. Bruce Bowen's your defensive specialist. You could slot him in instead of James Silas. I just personally like to have Silas on my team because I can use him at either position, shooting guard or point guard, where in this case Bowen is the fourth small forward on the list, which I don't see a lot of playing time for a guy that's fourth on the list. And finally, I round out the end of the roster with a very controversial person, and that is Alvin Robertson. Alvin Robertson was a defensive specialist as well. You could almost argue he belongs on there instead of Silas. And Robertson could play both positions, shooting guard, primarily shooting guard, but also point guard. But Robertson is often omitted from this game, in my opinion, because of his legal problems that he's had in the past. I'm not going to get into those. You can definitely Google them and find out about it. But Alvin Robertson, one of the best defenders one-on-one that ever has played the game. And I think because of his checkered legal issues is probably why he's not being considered a Hall of Famer. I think that if he would have kept things clean, he'd probably be in the Hall of Fame by now. But Alvin Robertson, defensive specialist, you could switch any of these three guys out with one another and still have a very good 13th man on this roster. So, who of course coaches this team? Shouldn't come as a shock to you. Gregg Popovich. You can find Gregg Popovich as the current Spurs coach. All you got to do is transfer him over to this Spurs coach. So, hopefully you agree with my lineup changes on this video. San Antonio Spurs are definitely a fun team to play with. I feel they're well balanced between their guards, their forwards, and their big men. So, definitely a fun team to play with. I look forward to your comments below. Thanks for watching another episode.